many, many missing people. It's extraordinary. And now we're going to be talking about the eastern United States. David, welcome back to Dreamland.
Thanks for the invite, Whitley. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, good. I'm very glad you're here, and I very much enjoyed a couple of months ago your conversation with George Knapp on Coast. I want to go a little bit beyond that today, if I may. And there is obviously a concentration of missing persons on the West Coast, especially around places like Yosemite, as we discussed. But what is different here is an awful lot of these eastern cases seem to me to be not quite as, you think people going missing in a place like Yellowstone is kind of explainable. Maybe not, but kind of. Not so true in the East United States, where things are a little bit more settled. So what are your thoughts about the difference between the two halves of the country, if any?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is just the topography of the area, east versus west. The west has the Rocky Mountains, the Sierras, real rough, steep, high country, whereas the east is predominantly swampy, low, flat. They have hills. They really don't have mountains, except maybe in New York where there's some high peak areas around Lake Placid. But in general, it's fairly flat. And with that comes a different dilemma on if this exists on the East Coast, then where do the bodies go? Where do the people go? How are they hidden? How do they disappear? And in essence, there is an entirely new element to that, and that is the swamps. And for people that live on the East Coast, they understand that this flatland area and much of the Far East comes with a lot of area that is extremely swampy. And that restricts a lot of the search for people, and searchers are probably reluctant to go into some areas that don't make sense, meaning a small child disappears, they come up to a swamp, and they know the swamp's up to their chest, and the child's 3 years old. Well, if this child entered the area, they're not going to be alive, so they don't go in and search. Yet maybe years later they go in and they find the child's skeleton and bones and clothing and et cetera, and they can't figure out how they got there. And sometimes, under rare circumstances, a search team will actually go out into the swamp, and they sometimes actually find them alive. So that's the one main difference. The other one being is that the state of Pennsylvania itself is probably the most unusual place in the U.S. as far as missing people. The number of children that disappeared in the early to mid-1900s is just unbelievable. It doesn't match any other state in the U.S., and it's so high that to try to find some relative reasoning behind why it occurred in this brief 26-year spat of time, I personally don't, and I've thrown it out to audiences before, is you tell me why it occurred then and it all of a sudden stopped. But Pennsylvania is one of those places that's just has always had a lot of children disappear, sometimes, and this is rare, but sometimes in pairs as well. But to me, the most unusual place in the Eastern Book is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the area around the park that has had just an inordinate amount of disappearances over the years. And as of just 3 or 4 months ago, it's still occurring. 2 more adults disappeared inside the park. They haven't been found. And I visited the park many times during my research, and when you're ready to go into it, we can talk about it. But the main differences between the East and the West topography, the numbers are fairly consistent. The number of clusters is fairly consistent. And if you look at my map that's in the book, and I have it on a huge map on the wall in my office, many of the disappearances follow right along the Appalachian Trail, which is a pretty unusual fact.
Well, yeah, I've walked large parts of the Appalachian Trail when I was younger, including in the Great Smoky Mountains, with no idea. I felt perfectly safe. And, it gets back in my mind to the disappearances in Indonesia that were described by Alan Lammers. And folks, if you're a subscriber, you can still listen to those shows. Just input the term Lammers into the search engine, and they'll come right up for you. The question is, in this case, in the case of Alan Lammers, the clothing people were wearing was crucial to whether or not they would get attacked and apparently moved into another dimension in which it seemed clear that they weren't going to have a very good experience. And this involved colorful clothing. And if you wore black or white clothing, you would not be bothered. Now, that seems so odd and mythological, and yet it was a physical fact because it happened to one of Alan's colleagues who happened to be wearing colorful socks, though he'd been told to wear only black or white. So could that have something to do with it? Could it be that there's something out there kind of between the worlds that maybe can only pick up on bright colors? I mean, what could be going on? Does the color of clothing, are there even any records about it in these cases in the U.S.?
Well, that, again, is a very difficult thing to find records of, and you have to be looking for something specific like that in the articles, because when you start diving into archives and reports and things, it's not intuitive to the people writing the reports or writing the articles specifically that clothing may be an important fact, because your intuition would tell you that people who go into the woods wearing bright clothing are the ones that should have been found, more likely than the people wearing dark colors or camouflage clothing, which would be harder to spot. And yes, that's one of those things that seems to come up more often than not, and I wrote about it in the book, and it's a very strange element. There's a couple of unusual disappearances in the Eastern book where I talk about where both the people that disappeared, and these are just two that I'll speak of many, they were wearing bright clothing. And when you want to get into those specific topics about cases, we'll talk about it. But yes, just like in the Western book, the Eastern has the same consistency when you can find that there is a notation about the clothing.
So then it seems to be possibly true here too. And, I have to say that my impression of what happened in Indonesia is that people were being taken, and there was a part of this. For those of you who aren't subscribers, let me just briefly, and for those subscribers who don't have time to re-listen to those other shows, describe a little bit of what happened. Alan went back he was a specialist in setting up radio stations, little self-powered radio stations in extremely isolated areas. He went back to this little community deep on the island of Sulawesi where they didn't even have electricity or anything, and set up this radio station, and then they gave out little radios that people could use so they could be more in contact with each other. And on the way in, they were told not to wear anything but black or white, and they thought it was some sort of mythology issue. But one man wore colored socks and got badly scratched up by something that he couldn't see, and nearly died out there from a fever. He didn't disappear. But when Alan got back to civilization, he discovered another friend's son had disappeared while hiking in a similar area with some friends. And 3 months later, he was found. The friends were never found. And he described finding himself and the others walking in an area with animals with antlers and things that didn't exist in Indonesia, and becoming very confused and seeing these strange, rather monstrous-looking little men walking behind them. And he eventually was found wandering months later in a state of tremendous debilitation. But he's one of the very few that came back, and he's still profoundly changed by what happened to him. And we get back, we're going to ask David a little bit about, are there any people who have come back? And if so, are there any stories? What did they describe happening to them? And if not, well, we're going to go on deeper. This is Whitley Strieber. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. Subscribers, I'd like to remind you that The Secret of Orenda is available from Unknown Country. You can go into the subscriber section and get a coupon that will take $3 off the cost of it in the unknowncountry.com store. The PDF there works on your computer or on an iPad. If you want to get a copy for your Nook or Kindle, go to their respective websites or go to orendabook.com. And you know, a lot of people are not buying this book at all. We've only sold maybe 50 copies so far out of all the thousands of people who listen, and I'm not quite sure why. So give it a look at least. It's really one of the most intense efforts I have ever made to reimagine the secrets of the past. It has a lot of energy in it and a lot of effort. And read the reviews on unknowncountry.com so far, or on Amazon. They're really good. It's worth having. We're talking to Dave Paulides. His new book, Missing 411, The Eastern United States, if anything, more chilling than the Western United States, because you have to think rough terrain might have something to do with it. But I've hiked the Smoky Mountains, and it's not rough terrain. It would, you have to work to disappear on those trails, especially on the Appalachian. It's very well marked in through there. So, Dave, what about it? Has anybody returned from these from a long period of disappearance? And if so, what did they say? How did they describe it?
Well, it's fairly consistent. The children that come back, many times they are too young to be able to speak. They're maybe 19, 24 months old. They're just learning how to walk, and they disappear. Other times it's people with disabilities, and we're talking serious disabilities that are inhibited in their speaking ability. And the other times, the adults that come back or the older children that come back, they don't remember. And when they're questioned, they say, you know, I remember I was at this last location, and then I remember I took a few steps, and then I really don't remember what happened to me. And that's a fairly consistent trend. Very, very, very few times do people actually remember anything. Sometimes stories along the Appalachian Trail where women were hiking alone, they'd speak of men, and they're not real clear on the definition, but they say that men were chasing them on the trail. One specific case where a woman was chased for 3 days. She ended up dumping her backpack because it slowed her down. She didn't see anybody for days, and she said it was a series of men who chased her, and she had to hide consistently to stay away. But she never supplied an in-depth description, and she never explained how exactly she was able to evade them. But there's a couple of those stories where people were chased in or near that trail.
Boy, it sounds like a good premise for a horror movie, because that sounds kind of down to earth there. The children being unable to remember is stranger, of course. Bud Hopkins told a story about a man who had disappeared for months and had come back, found wandering around, and had absolutely no memory whatsoever of what had happened to him. And, you'd think, well, maybe they're going into fugue states or something, but people don't disappear for lengths of time and go into fugue states and then come back in able even to walk. I mean, they wouldn't come back. They'd eventually die. So, let me ask you this. What is your sense, your overall sense? Obviously, some of these cases are conventionally explainable. There's no question there. But not all. And the not all, of course, is what interests us here on this program. And what is your sense of this? You've studied this more than anybody I've ever known. Alan has one case in one situation, a very unusual one. But you have vast knowledge. What do you think could be happening to them?
I don't think that there's one scenario that fits the bill. And if there's one rationale behind it, then it's something that we have really no handle on. It's obviously something that's very strong, very quick, stealthy, has some ability at taking the mind at some level. It's a real unusual paradigm that, with a little bit of knowledge from a lot of different areas, I don't see one thing that can take it. I mean, the kids sometimes disappear in extremely close proximity to their parents and guardians. Adults disappear in the same sort of scenarios. It's quite an unusual thing to look into, because at the beginning, when you start to read one or two, you start to believe, just as you stated earlier, okay, it's a common disappearance. But when the elements start to replicate themselves time after time after time, it's easy to say, okay, well, there's a consistency here that really nobody's ever looked at. There's a lot of stories in the Eastern books where kids are staying at their farm or rural ranch or mountain home, and they disappear with their dog. And there's many, many stories like this where they disappear with a dog. The dog maybe comes back in a day. The kid doesn't come back. And then there's a giant search, and the child is found deceased in an area that has been searched multiple times. And when you see that in an article or in a report, it's re-emphasizing that it's a troubling event to the searchers, because they don't understand how it got there, because it wasn't there when they searched. This is something that occurs also in the West. And I gave a talk in June of this year at the National Association of Search and Rescue People. It was their annual conference in Lake Tahoe. And I guess one of their people read the book, and they said I should be there and present. And it was an absolutely packed room, and at the end, dozens and dozens of searchers were there to talk about their experiences similar to what I'm telling you today. And I know some people will say, oh, this is crap, this isn't true. But the people that actually do the work, when they come and tell you and they say, hey, this has never been talked about before, but yeah, we were on a search and we covered this area dozens of times, and then we found the body right in the middle of a search plane that we had searched 10 times, or on a path that we had walked out a dozen times. And they're asking me the same thing that you're asking. Well, what could be causing this? I really have no idea. And it's a scary event. I used to be somebody that went to the woods all the time. It was my recreation place. I honestly look at it entirely different now.
Yeah, well, you're not alone there, boy, because I used to go to the woods all the time, and I had, of course, a close encounter of the third kind in the woods. And I also had another situation develop in which I've always thought that had I walked down that path, I would not have come back. And my listeners know that. I'll just remind you very briefly, because we want to stay with this. This was the incident in February of 1986, I believe, where I was sort of called, and I was getting ready to go down the path, and I heard a voice that was so menacing, urging me to come closer, that I just didn't go down the path. I went back into my room, into my house. I've always thought, and I wonder if people don't sometimes go down the path. But I have another question. Of the children who have been found deceased, is there any consistency with the condition of their bodies or any indication of how they may have died?
The bodies on the young found deceased and the young found alive are pretty consistent in that there's scratches over their entire body. Many times they're missing clothing, sometimes a lot of clothing. Sometimes they're found naked. Other times, if they're found alive, and this is something that's unusual because I doubt it's noted in many archived articles by the reporters, but in, say, a dozen or so, they say that the child was in excellent health, but they had a minor temperature.
Well, here's the interesting thing here. This relates back to Alan Lammers. Scratches were what this man who had the colorful clothing on experienced. Something started scratching him that he could not see on his legs where these the Argyle socks were. and he got a fever. It's exactly what happened. He nearly died of it. So when we get back, we're going to go a little deeper yet into this chilling story. Hiking anybody? Well, we'll think about it. We'll be right. We're talking to David Paulides, Missing 411, the Eastern United States, looking into just what is going on out there. You know, David, something occurred to me. Back in 1989, I had an object, an implant, which is to this day still in my ear, put into my ear by two people who came into my house in the middle of the night and did this, and this thing has been studied. It's a very unusual piece of material. Now, you think of missing children, and this was done by people, not by any kind of aliens. And then I wondered to myself, maybe I'm just going off the deep end here, I don't know. Could they have been raised somewhere in what Richard Dolan calls a breakaway civilization and now be part of a kind of another world, do you suppose? I'm just conjecturing here, and I don't expect you to give a definitive answer, but is there any indication that, for example, in later years, have any of the relatives of the victims ever said that they had the sense that the person was somewhere near them or had returned in some way, at least briefly?
I'd never heard that, but as you can expect, I've received hundreds and hundreds of emails from people that have their own twist on what might have happened here. And some of them were very well written, quite thought through, and came from intellectual types. And one specifically was about the ages of many of these kids, between the age of, say, 6 and 9. And they stated that this is the observation the person made, is that these children are at the age where they can take care of themselves, essentially, but they're at that optimum age of learning. And they thought it was unusual that this was the age when the kids disappeared and were taken because of that.
Because it's the ideal age in which you could imprint children, and also where they could be more or less self-sustaining. They would require no more care than an adult.
Right.
A little more care, but not that much.
Right.
Very, very interesting and very strange stuff. David, I want to discuss specific cases, but before we get to that, I'd like to find out a little bit more about what kind of response there is. For example, I looked before we got on the air about the Great Smoky Mountains National Park website and so forth, and there just is nothing about this. They don't seem to want to. It seems like Yellowstone. Is that policy nationwide, that they simply don't talk about cases like this?
Well, so the Park Service, on the front end of every disappearance, puts out a press release. They have a massive search, and the search usually lasts a week. If it's an adult, maybe only 3 or 4 days. But if it's a child, it may go longer. And then after that, you essentially hear nothing. And this was the premise and the concern for some people who originally contacted me about this. And it seems to be consistent across the board about the pragmatic way that the Park Service goes about their business. And it would appear that they put on a public front of concern for maybe the family or for people who have knowledge of the disappearance at that front end. But afterwards, you never hear of anything. No follow-up searches, no locations, no, say, pin maps of the map showing where most of the disappearances have occurred. No pin map showing times and dates and locations of where these people disappeared so they could ask for assistance in finding them. Nothing. And when you ask the Park Service for their numbers of disappearances, they don't keep track of that. The number of disappearances by parks, they don't keep track of that. The number of people
they do, but they just won't tell you, I would guess.
Yeah, I hate to think that they're lying and under the Freedom of Information Act and failing to give, the information. But when you start talking to seasoned law enforcement people who have ran some of the biggest organizations in the U.S., they state it would be merely impossible for the Park Service to be so idiotic as not to track this basic information.
Well, of course, at the same time, it's a bureaucracy, so it may be that idiotic. That's not impossible to believe. However, my best guess, that's very far from true, that, in fact, they do track them, and they're very well aware of it, and they don't want the public to be afraid to go to the parks. You know, when my son, who has little children, heard your previous broadcast, he said, I'm never taking my kids to Yellowstone. And I don't blame him. I wouldn't either. And it's not because they may disappear there. It's because of the fact that the Park Service is so closed about data, like you'd like to know where it happens. Does it happen in one place in the park, in a given park, more than another? Well, for example, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, does it happen in a specific general area?
So in the Smokies, I don't think that there is one specific small isolated area. I could put a circle on the map of the Smokies going from the Appalachian Trail going east towards the Carolinas, where there appears to be that one area where most have gone missing. And the Appalachian Trail is where two people, Trenny Gibson and Dennis Martin, or very close to the Appalachian Trail, where both of those disappeared. And I can't say it's super isolated, but we generally know where they're going. But the one thing about the Smokies and parts of New York and parts of Arkansas and Oklahoma is that there is this little tight area where, you know, in general, the Smoky Mountain National Park, it's unusual. It isn't every national park in the U.S. where these disappearances occur. It's isolated.
Specific, like there are a lot of parks that are like the Big Bend down in Texas, where there are very few by comparison to say Yellowstone and the Smokies, and yet it's wilder and much more difficult to negotiate.
Yeah,
and much harder to find people back in there too. I know it well.
There you go. So why is it occurring at these others? I don't know.
Well, okay, we're coming to the end of our time together on Dreamland, but we're going to continue in the subscriber area discussing some specific cases and getting into something about the Pennsylvania disappearances that's really very, very odd, and about that we'll talk about in more detail.